In this video, I am going to provide you with a construction method that might or might not be approved by your local building authorities or engineers, but it will provide you with what I consider to be an inexpensive repair and one that will not require any concrete footings for anyone who needs to raise some sagging floor joist in a crawl space. And I came up with this repair suggestion by examining an older house that didn't have any concrete foundations, and instead it was sitting directly on top of some heavy-duty boards, and the boards looked like they might have been around 16 inches square. So when I say heavy-duty, they were heavy-duty, and the building was over 100 years old, and these boards weren't treated. They were just regular pieces of lumber, and of course some of them were damaged. So with that in mind, I am going to consider this to be a temporary repair, and when I say temporary, I don't know how long it could last, but don't see any reason why it couldn't last for over 20 years. So let's go ahead with my first choice, and that would be a railroad tie, even though I did read some articles suggesting that railroad ties have creosote in them, and the creosote can soak into the ground and create problems for your soil, which takes me back to the point I made earlier that you might need to verify some of this information with your local building authorities. Next up on the list would be some type of ground-rated pressure-treated lumber, and whether or not you're going to have an easy time dragging these large pieces of lumber into your crawl space. You could always use shorter pieces, and these pieces could be treated lumber or construction standard, depending upon how temporary this repair is going to be. So let's go ahead and get rid of the other pieces of wood and focus on using our railroad tie. Now keep in mind, a lot of railroad ties are not going to be nice and straight like this, and you're probably going to want to select the straightest one possible or the straightest ones to use. And then after you have dragged it into place, you can measure the distance between the bottom of the floor joist and the top of the beam so that you can cut a couple of pieces of lumber, and maybe in a variety of different sizes, that will end up being your structural supports and your shims that will go underneath these structural supports. And I will leave it up to you whether you use any type of treated lumber for this, or if you just grab some scraps to create the brace that's going to help support the sagging joist. Now at the very least, if you can't move the joist very much because there might be a load-bearing wall sitting on top of it, then at the very least you're going to provide some structural support that's going to reduce or eliminate additional sagging in the future. Now, I suggested cutting a few different lengths of lumber. However, you could start by measuring each one of these individually and cutting them accordingly. So, for example, if I needed 10 inches here, but I needed 10.5 inches for the next one, then I could simply write those measurements on a block of wood or a piece of paper, take them outside of the crawl space area to where it'd be more comfortable to cut everything, and then just cut a few different sizes. And again, you don't need to get carried away with this. You can always cut about 4 or 5 blocks, 4 or 5 brace connectors, and a pile of different sized shim boards. For example, here they're 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches, and they range from 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 inch thick to 3/4 of an inch. And don't forget your trusty jack either, with a block of wood that you're going to be able to use either at the top or the bottom to raise the joist. And you can do this a couple of different ways. The first method I'm going to show you here will be to attach some type of a connector, and here we're using a piece of OSB that can be either 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch thick, and we attached it to a 2x4 and then used the jack to raise the joist. After you have it about where you want it, you can always install a shim board underneath the support brace and on top of the large beam. So again, not too difficult here. And in the second method I wanted to show you, you could always attach the brace connector to the joist and then raise the joist to where you want it, and then measure and cut your support brace blocks to where you won't need to install some type of a shim block underneath them. And of course, I am probably making it sound simpler than it is going to be sometimes, because this method here isn't going to work very well if you need to jack everything up in sections. And And if that's the case, you're going to want to go with this method here, to where you can raise it up maybe 1/4 of an inch at a time, install your 1/4 inch shim underneath it, and then raise this one up 1/4 of an inch, and then raise the next one up 1/4 of an inch, and then come back, and when you raise this one up 1/4 of an inch, you might be able to pull the 1/4 of an inch piece out and replace it with a 1/2 inch piece. And then of course, if you had a block that had maybe 4 or 5 shims underneath it, you could always jack the joist up and then remove this block and replace it with a full-length block to get rid of all of the shims. Now, something else I need to point out is that this beam right here can actually over time sink into the ground, because remember, we're not dealing here with a concrete footing, and I'm not about to suggest that concrete footings don't sink into the ground either. However, if it does sink into the ground, then you're going to need to get back under the house with the jack and some more shims and raise it up again to install some new shims underneath the support braces to get everything back into its proper position. Now, I would also like to point out is that if this happens within the first 6 months or maybe even the first year, and you jack everything back up and it happens again within the next year or 6 months, then you might need to go to a different method, because sometimes there's just going to be too much weight above the floor, or you're going to be dealing with some type of soil issues that aren't going to be strong enough to support the beam. However, again, I will leave that up to you. If this happens within 2 years and you don't ever want to crawl under here again, then you might want to try something else. Now, another thing you can do to create a little more structural support to stabilize the support studs would be to install some type of structural sheathing and then screw or nail that into all of the framing components. And again, you can see where something like this isn't going to be difficult. If you have to raise the joist again, then you're going to be able to install all of the shims if you needed to raise any of the floor joist again. And something else that you might need to be concerned about would be subterranean termites. And if that's the case, you might need to install some type of a termite shield on top of the structural beam, or scrap this method entirely and use other methods. But I really don't know how big of a concern subterranean termites would be with something like this, if the termites could simply go about 5 or 6 feet away on either side of the beam here and build their tunnels to access all of your floor framing. But again, I thought I would point it out. And since I can't think of much more to talk about in this video, I will go ahead and call it quits. And for those of you who have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment area. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure you tell others about our channel, and let us know by either hitting the thumbs up button or leaving a comment in the comment area.